Have you had an encounter you'd like to hear narrated on this channel? Well, if so, send me an email with all the details. You can email me at contact@buckeyebigfoot.com. Hi, Nance. This story comes from an older fella in my neighborhood. He's the kind that doesn't use the internet. Never has, never will. But one day we were jawing together and I mentioned your channel. I was telling him about some of the stories I remember that you've told. He suddenly lit up. Let's call him Dave. Dave is a good guy with good humor about him, and he's still very active and fit for a man in his late 60s. And if I remember all that he told me right, this happened less than a decade ago. Once we started talking Bigfoot, Dave opened up and told me his own Bigfoot story. I was blown away. I asked him if I could send it in to you. He said yes. I hope you find it as interesting as I did. Dave and I live in Louisiana. He began his story by reminiscing about a time not too far gone when movies were getting big tax write-offs to film in our state. The movie business in Louisiana was booming for what would be a relatively short-lived amount of time. In any case, Dave wasn't in the movie business himself. At that time, he was working at a fiberglass fabricator in St. Gabriel, about a 20-minute drive outside of Baton Rouge. But he did have a friend, and let's call that friend John, who was trying to break into the movies. One day, John reached out to Dave for some help. John was helping a short film crew scout out some locations in the Atchafalaya Basin. They were looking to shoot a horror movie, and nothing worked quite as well as good old-fashioned rural swampland. Being from Shreveport, John didn't know much about the area, but Dave and his family frequently visited the basin throughout his childhood. Dave hadn't been out there in a while, and he was all too happy to accompany John on his trip. They decided to make a weekend out of it, crashing at Dave's uncle's place in Breaux Bridge during their stay. For the uninitiated, the Atchafalaya Basin is a huge stretch of wetlands out in Louisiana, even bigger than the Everglades. It's probably the perfect ideal of Louisiana swampland, all the way down to the live oaks, the cypress trees, and the gators. Parts of it are sandwiched between Baton Rouge and Lafayette, although many of the areas where Dave and John were scouting were mostly uninhabited. They started with a few places where they could easily peel off the side of the road and just wade into some nice pockets of marshy swamp. John insisted on leaving before the sun could come up, as most of the filming would be happening at the crack of dawn, and he wanted accurate photos to send back to the director. By the time they arrived at the first site, the sun had just peeked out over the oak trees, and the way Dave described the scene makes me just plain green with envy. He said it was the most calm he had ever felt out in the basin, watching light pour through gnarled branches, looking down at the water and seeing the reflections of the cypresses stretching out into the sky, and hearing nothing else but the chirp of the birds and the buzzing of insects. So John got to work taking pictures while Dave waited around and pointed out some good spots. Dave joked that he was there more for morale than anything else. They did this a few more times as the day went on, hopping into the truck, driving for a while, and hopping back out to scope out their surroundings. It was later in the evening when they were photographing another one of these wetland forest areas when John left Dave for a bit to go get another memory card from the truck. While waiting, Dave occupied himself with whistling and strolling through knee-deep water in his waders. Dave says it was hard to tell how long he was out there on his own. Couldn't have been too long, though. But the minute he stopped whistling, something broke the tranquility in a way that made him jump out of his hide. He heard something. It was hard not to hear. What exactly it was, though, he couldn't say right away, but it was louder than anything he'd ever heard out in those swamps. He froze up. He stood completely still, like he needed his whole body to listen just to understand what he was hearing. It sounded once, this strange, wild call, and it stopped just as abruptly as it had started. Dave said the first time it happened, he stood at attention and stayed there, just darting his eyes around, but not daring to move his head even an inch. Now, Dave is a rough and tumble kind of guy, has been all his life. He's been on his fair share of hunting trips, fishing trips, camping trips, you name it. And most of his excursions have been in and immediately around the state of Louisiana. Dave's in and has been around these parts his whole life, and to this day he says he still hasn't heard anything quite like it since. But while Dave didn't recognize what was making the sound right away, he had been around the block enough times to know what the nature of call was: a warning. In Dave's own words, there's only 2 reasons for that kind of hootin' and hollerin', and he had a feeling it wasn't mating season. When I asked Dave to describe or imitate the noise, he said it was round and throaty, like some cross between a wolf howling and a human man wailing. He said it almost sounded like ape and monkey noises as he heard them in the movies, but yet still more human than ape. He said it sounded like fury and pain. So human, though, that it was confusing. So wild that it was terrifying. So a few things ran through Dave's head right away. One, this creature, because it was definitely a creature or animal of some kind, is either really loud, really close, or, worst of all, both. And 2, it knew exactly where Dave was, which is to say out of his depth and in its territory. And 3, if Dave wanted to leave this situation in one piece, he had to vacate the premises immediately and calmly. Dave knew enough about running into wildlife to know you shouldn't make sudden movements, and that the key to making it out alive was to be alert, but respectful. So while making his exit, Dave made slow arm movements to signal that he was human, and he kept his head slightly bowed to show he wasn't directly threatening whoever it was that he defended. The whole time that Dave was doing this, his eyes were moving back and forth around him, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had made the noise. It was tough, because he didn't want to lift his head too much, and he was also moving backwards, trying to steer clear of any trees or debris as he waded back towards the road. With the view that he did have, however, he did see something. Ripples in the water below him, coming from the opposite direction. The ripples were thin and long, so he knew whatever was out there couldn't have been too close. At the same time, the howling came a second time, rough, percussive, and loud. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, as Dave recalls that the sound was so loud that it seemed to fill up all the space around him. He tried to shuffle faster, or as fast as he thought he could without risking a full chase. As he backed onto his first steps of solid ground, making his way out of the swamp and the woods, the howling came a third time, distinctly farther away now, but still as powerful as the first 2 calls. Whatever was yelling at him, it didn't want him anywhere near its territory. Once he felt he was a safe distance away, Dave made a break for the road and saw that John was already in the truck and behind the wheel. After he hopped into the passenger seat, the 2 men just looked at each other, both wide-eyed and knowing. John had apparently heard the howling too, and had had half a mind to drive away, nearly leaving Dave behind. The engine was already started, but the 2 silently stared out the window towards the marsh just a moment longer, hoping to catch even the slightest glimpse of what had chased Dave out of the swamp. They stared there for a hot minute, and didn't see much of anything in between the trees. It was getting darker at that point, and while it was hard to make out the finer details, Dave also knew that any movement at all should have been obvious from where they were sitting. And then he saw a shadow move between the cypresses. The movement was slight, and it only lasted half a moment, but the shadow was so large, so strange-looking, that Dave couldn't help but let out a yelp. John saw it too, and quickly decided that he didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. He put the truck in drive and sped back down the road as fast as that engine would take them. For a while, Dave and John didn't say anything to each other. They just looked straight ahead in the silence, and occasionally Dave would glance at the rearview mirror just on a whim. Around the time they started driving past houses and other signs of life, John just started laughing out of nowhere. Dave looked at him, puzzled, but John just carried on laughing. He was in such a tizzy that he pulled off at a gas station to wipe the tears out of his eyes. "That sure was something," John said. "They sure got us good, huh?" Dave asked him what he meant by that. "Who got them?" "Oh, I don't know," John said. "I bet it was some teenagers or something. You remember how it used to be, right? Getting into all kinds of trouble just 'cause you were bored?" Dave realized what John was saying. He thought that someone was trying to play a trick on them, and that the howling they had heard was nothing more than a couple of mischief makers trying to get some kicks. Dave was not convinced in the least, but it didn't take a scientist to tell that John just wanted an explanation. Whatever they had seen or heard back in the swamp had him rattled, and he wanted to write it off. So Dave, trying to be a good friend and all, smiled and laughed along with John for a moment, hoping it would help take the edge off. Even though Dave had decided to go along with John's prankster story, it didn't stop either of them from getting drunk about it the moment they got back to Bro Bridge that night. John made it clear that he didn't want to talk any more about what happened that first day of scouting, at least until the weekend was over. Dave said that his friend was real jittery all of the next day, startling at the littlest sounds, and driving them back to his uncle's before the sun had even set. On their last day of scouting, the two men visited a couple of residences in St. Martinville, places that local property owners were offering up to film crews on a regular basis. One of the homes they visited was owned by a man whose family had been in the area since the early 1900s. The property they visited had two different houses, the one where the owner lived currently, and the family home. Even though the owner was letting John scout the family home, he also warned them that the house wasn't regularly maintained and hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. The owner's great-grandmother had been something of a hoarder and had left behind such a massive amount of belongings and junk that very few of her descendants had dared to examine most of it. While John was busy photographing the house, Dave struck up a conversation with the owner, and they shared stories about all of their various memories of the basin over the years. After a while of this kind of talk, Dave finally decided to bite the bullet and mention the encounter they had a couple days before. He tried to be casual about it, asking the owner if he'd ever heard any weird wildlife calls while out in the swamp. When the owner asked him what he meant, Dave told him that they'd heard some strange things earlier that weekend, and he was only wondering if it was an animal or just some local teenagers playing tricks on them. At that point, Dave could tell that the owner was paying very close attention and fishing with specific questions and the like. So Dave went ahead and told the whole story, trying not to leave out any important details. The whole time, the owner was as quiet as the grave, just listening real close and nodding at certain parts. When Dave finished, the owner just nodded and wordlessly beckoned him to the family home, where he led him up the stairs into a second-story bedroom. Dave said that whole house looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s at the latest. The building was sagging the way that old swamp houses tend to do, and everything was covered in dust and other grime. The bedroom the owner brought him to was filled with stacks upon stacks of photo albums, hardcover books, and newspapers bound up in twine. The owner went over to a dresser and pulled open the top drawer. He grabbed a folder that looked newer and cleaner than everything else around them, and then he carefully picked out a bundle of photographs tied together with rubber bands. The picture he was looking for was at the very top. He handed it to Dave. It was black and white and grainy. Dave squinted at it for a long time. It was a picture of a wooded marsh, just like the ones him and John had been taking pictures of all weekend. Dave said his heart started pounding just looking at the picture. Without having said a single word about it, he knew exactly what the owner was showing him. And then he saw it. It wasn't in detail. It wasn't sharp or in focus. It could have been brushed off as just a trick of the light. But having seen it in person, Dave knew that it was the same silhouette of the giant figure that he heard and saw just 2 days before. The owner said that his grandfather had taken this back in the 1960s. His grandfather and his great-uncle had been out hunting birds in the basin when they heard the same sounds that Dave had described, and they were daring enough to try to go back and take a photograph. They thought it was a rougarou, but according to the owner's grandfather, it was much bigger, hairier, and more upright than what they had imagined. Similar to Dave and John, once they'd seen it with their own eyes, they decided not to dally. They snapped an imperfect picture and hightailed it out of there before they overstayed their welcome. I sure hope you liked this story as much as I did. Dave says that he hasn't gone looking for the creature since that day, and his friend John has gradually become more comfortable admitting what it was that they really ran into out there in the basin. A certified, grade A, Bayou Bigfoot. All right, my Sasquatch, I do hope you liked that one. I was very partial when I got that email. As you all know, I used to live in Louisiana. I'm very partial to Louisiana. So this was really right up my bayou, I guess you could say, instead of my alley. This was right up my bayou, and it made me smile a lot. So thank you very much for sending that in. The person didn't give me permission to use their name, so we're going to leave them as anonymous. I don't have a lot more to tell you folks, except that the work on the podcast and the other channels is moving forward. We have a release date now of Labor Day weekend. We're doing that because we're going to try to put about 10 episodes together for each one when we release them, so you can binge listen, which I know a lot of you love to do. So as it gets closer, I will let you know. We're releasing Under a Dark Moon first as the channel. The channel is up. It's there. There's nothing there. But yeah, as soon as you want, you can subscribe. I'll let you know when there's something there worth listening to. All right, folks. Well, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for staying with me. We will be back again next Tuesday. But until we do meet up again, please always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.